Alright, hello. Welcome to my MDL season recap. So, sorry, Ryan, I stole this format from you, but unlike your format, I'm not going to be assigning numbers to anything. No rankings or anything like that, because I want to keep this a bit more objective to what I think is valuable in my team. So I'm going to be going over each of my mods, giving some thoughts, pros and cons, and maybe even a highlight play or two for them. And as well, I'm going to go over some draft thoughts, some play thoughts after the fact. So yeah, let's just get right into this. Alright, so starting things off with our Mons recap, I'm just not going to cover Cresselia, Sojourner, or Frostless during this review, really because I didn't use them enough, and frankly I got rid of them very quickly. Except for Frostless, which is an end of season pickup, and I never got the chance to use it. Also, an honorable mention does go out to Emolga, who I did plan to bring in Week 3 versus Nen with a Cell Battery offensive set. However, I wasn't able to bring it to this game because they weren't actually running in that many electric types that it was meant to counter. Alright, so whenever I use Incineroar, just starting off here, I found it to be a great Intimidate user that can cycle in and out with its Parting Shot and its U-turn. I didn't get to use U-turn much because Parting Shot was very good. And it has a very high physical attack stat that I found to be very threatening. A lot of opponents had to pay respect to it. However, because of all this, Incineroar became a very high priority target, and due to its middling defenses, it can't really stick around and take more than 1 or 2 hits. So, I don't have too much to talk about Incineroar here because I didn't really get to make too many nice plays with it. It didn't come into very many successful battles of mine. However, I would draft it again, just not really in my team comp. So I can't really talk that much about Incineroar, but I can talk about Kartana. Now, Kartana was my favorite fast physical sweeper to use here on my entire team. Now, I found it was great at just nuking a high priority target, and just the ability to take at least one thing out of the picture before anything else can get done, and before it can set up or really do anything, I found to be very valuable for my team. Now, I did find that the common Assault Vest sets with Kartana were just a bit too frail for draft leagues because you can prep for that. And if you could prep for a max special defense and Assault Vest Kartana, why even bother running it? So I did also find that Kartana's speed, I believe it's at 115, was just a little bit too slow to get a lot of stuff done. My apologies, it's either 115 or 109. But it's a bit too slow to really outspeed some of those high priority targets and to take out those sweepers before anything can get done. So I found that often I might have to use Scarf Tana. So it wasn't ideal, however, it did throw off a lot of teams running a Scarf on the already super fast Kartana. And that gave me a bit of an edge. Now, of course, this leads us into our first highlight, which is Game 3 versus Noah. And this turn that we're showing right here, turn 1, is a perfect encapsulation of how it can just take out a high priority target. I knew from game 2 that Gastrodon it was a very big threat to my team, so being able to Dynamax it, as a good Dynamax mon, mind you, allowed it to ignore the fake out, and then immediately take down that Gastrodon with help with the Aerodactyl support. Next up we have Latias. And honestly, this is my first transaction I made right at week 2, and I wasn't very high on it going into it. I know I made a statement about not being really into dragon types, but of course I hadn't played for a while. But I found that I really loved the versatility of this mod. Now, of course, the first thing I've noted is that it has very solid defenses, and it just gave it a certain survivability that not a lot of my mods had, especially my offensive ones. And it also has a great special attack stat, which actually makes it a pretty decent threat with those two combined, where it's going to dish out a lot of damage if you don't target it down. And it has a decent amount of defenses where you have to basically double into it if you don't want it to get an attack off. So it's very good at redirecting priority because, of course, of how good it is. So I tend to find that it's phenomenal at late game cleanup, where I can just keep it in the back, keep a nuker in the front, and get rid of a high priority target, and just use Latias to take advantage of that lack of extra oomph that their team has, and I can just go through one by one. Now, I did find that despite the good defenses, defensive sets aren't very viable on this mod, at least in my comp, where just the raw special defense stat on this mod is just so good that you can just use hard offensive sets and not have to worry about its survivability, because it's going to live a hit. It's going to live 2-3 turns, and you don't have to invest in it at all. For our next highlight here, we've got the 1v3 that Latios had in Game 3 versus Ryan in Week 9. Now, we're seeing here this first turn of the 1v3, where Raikou trades out the Gyarados for the Heatran that the Gyarados picked up last turn, leaving Latias as the only Pokemon on my field, and the Vaporeon Raikou and the Togekiss on Ryan's. Now, this is really putting in perspective how good the bulk and offensive power you can put into Latias is. Where even though it's not the speediest thing, it's just able to take just enough hits to get these late game cleanups. So that with just proper target prioritization, I'm able to pick up the Vaporeon, then the Togekiss, and now on this last turn, the Raikou. So this is why I really appreciate Latias, and think that it's one of my best mods on my draft. So Gyarados, I find fairly difficult to bring to games due to its abundance of weaknesses, mainly to flying and to rock. But I did find that a major strength of it, and a lot of why I brought it to matchups, is its coverage options. And along with that, it works very well on my team composition due to my Swampert and my Nidoking being able to balance out those weaknesses despite sharing some types between the core 3 of them. Now, I will say that its physical attack along with its coverage is pretty damn good. I have to admit, it never felt like a burden to hit the certain amount of the certain damage calcs. I mean, I wasn't expecting it to do anything too great. However, it was pretty damn good when I needed it to be. For Gyarados, we do have a highlight for versus Ryan Game 3 again. Same sort of clip just before the last one, which really shows off the coverage options that Gyarados really has. I ran it as a Scarf this time instead of anything you would expect like a Lumberry, but it really paid off, especially against a Scarf Heatran that I was not expecting. Next up, we have King, which I found to be a very, very fun mon to use. Mainly because of how much coverage it has. Also has a fairly unique typing in Poison Ground that not many other mons have, despite it being a Gen 1 mon. Um, it does work very well with Swampert because of, well, despite being a ground type like Swampert, they don't share any weaknesses, really. So that's always fun. Plus, they fill different niches. King being very good at specially sweeping, whereas Swampert is really good at cleanup kills and taking a lot of hits. Now, I will say I didn't have much support for King on my team, which is kind of unfortunate because I did like using it a lot. It really requires a decent amount of speed control around it just to make sure that it can move before its big threats. Especially with Tailwind running around, you don't want to run this thing into a Tailwind without a Tailwind of your own. So you're also forcing it to Dynamax in that case, which gets rid of extra boosts, like the Life Orb that you might run on it because of Sheer Force will start to actually damage you and other things. So you really don't like Dynamaxing Nidoking, but it becomes very important for survivability. And again, just touching on it a bit more, the coverage on this mon, it's pretty great. You really don't appreciate how good it is having Earth Power, Sludge Bomb, Flamethrower, Shadow Ball, Thunderbolt, and Ice Beam all on the same mon until you get to use it. So I did find it very great. So next up we have the Devil itself, Klefki, my Lord and Savior. So I found Klefki very, very good at disrupting. I really like to think of Klefki as a disruption mon at its core. Because it forces other opponents just to make so many suboptimal plays. It's just so annoying to deal with. And having it on my team, which tends to be very hyper offensive, is actually a lot more useful than I was expecting going in. Klefki was originally a backup of a backup mon for me. I was wanting Sylveon at first for something a little bit more bulky. I don't even remember what the other mon I was wanting is, but I ended up with Klefki. And honestly, the Prankster Switchero setups were always very nice. Running Misty Terrain was also fairly interesting, you know? Misty Terrain was a great counter to Rillaboom, and despite me not being able to run it into the Rillaboom, because Rillaboom didn't actually come to that game versus Ryan, it was still very, very useful. So, of course, I have to go back, touch on Switchero here, because I think Switchero is the most depth that Klefki has in its move pool. Because no matter what it's running, you can find a strategy to run around it. And in prep, opponents have to take into account all the different Switcheroo options. Like Switcheroo Lacking Tail, that only kicks in like the turn after. But despite that, it's very useful to shut down the big speed control dependent mons. Especially the ones that have a lot of speed investment like Regieleki. Now, of course I didn't play any Regielekis, but it would have been nice if I did. Now, also this eject button was very nice on it, because I did run that in week 3 versus Nin, and that was able to shut down a water compaction Palisand on the turn that it was getting set up and Dynamaxed. So that was very nice to use. I wouldn't call Klefki an MVP because of this, just because we didn't get to come to every matchup, it wasn't good in every matchup. It was really fun to use when I did, and it was very annoying for people when they had to play against it. Also, it hits very surprisingly well with its Dazzling Gleam and Flash Cannon. Of course, it doesn't always like running a special attack, but you have nothing much else to run other than that, because its defenses make it very, very frail. And its HP being, I think, in the 50s, you can't really run much on it. So if you're just running speed enough to speed creep whenever you can, and then a lot of special attack, you should be fairly solid with this. Now, you can't surprise people with the flash cannon, which honestly it did catch a few people off guard. But the dazzling gleam, it doesn't hit too well. But who it does hit, who you want it to hit, it will hit fairly easily. You can't make it hit any calcs though. Now, this highlight play is going to be Week 6 versus Dan in Game 1. This is a very good display of why Klefki is a great disruptor. Because it didn't get to pull off exactly when it wanted to against Dan. My plan was here to switch a ring target onto the Landorus in order to negate a lot of its extra immunities due to its flying type and its ground type. But instead I got it onto Sharna and I got back its mental herb. I was able to, the following turn, switch that mental herb onto the Regirock, which maxed, and I got its weakness policy in return, which was able to just shut down the offensive presence of that Regirock before it was able to get anything done. With that weakness policy onto the Klefki, of course the Klefki went down that turn, I was able to then pivot into a better mon that was able to deal with that Regirock a lot better, and eventually I won that game 1 and the set, which was my first big upset of the league, which is of course why I see this as the highlight play. So next up is Swampert, which is honestly in contention for the low tier MVP of the league, and also contesting another one of my mods, which we'll get to in a bit. But this thing is very, very good at coming up in the back, taking some cleanup kills, and just having a utility move or two, like Brick Break, for example, just to give it that extra bit of oomph and value on my team. So, also, I guess its main issue is that sometimes it just needs to do too much in its role on my team, and it's spread a bit too thin. So, like, it could need to take a physical hit while surviving a special grass move. So, at that point, you kind of have to pick one or the other and then play around it. Of course, I did like using Swampert a lot. If I'm giving it this much praise, I kind of have to, or else it'd be kind of weird, not gonna lie. But yeah, I really did enjoy using Swampert. And of course, that leads us straight into the highlight play, which is Wildcard game versus Milla. Alright, so I have to say, this highlight was in contention with against Dan game 3 with the red card and being able to pressure out that Feeble like that. But instead we've got this, and this is I believe, a 3v3 with Kartana immediately going down. And here we get to see the Brick Break Swampert variant with the Life Orb. And it's not too impressive, but it really shows off how Swampert's able to get these cleanup kills and efficiently get those one-shots where it needs to. Now, of course, it gets the kill onto the Swampert, or not the Swampert, the Morgrim, and takes down the Reflect with it. And now we've got a 2v2 with the Tyranitar and Rotom versus my Swampert and my Latias. So, Rotom goes unmaxed, and we're able to see the Latias gets the Draco out onto Rotom, kills it, and Swampert's able to get the Oko with Liquidation. So, with that being said, I think this is pretty good of a highlight. I don't know why I chose not to use Brick Break, but I believe it was because Stab. But you guys get to see the rest of this highlight. Alright, so this is gonna be the simplest one of the bunch. My man Xiao. So I did find it to be a very good offensive support option. Being able to use Fake Out and Coaching, which is really good for my hyper-offensive physical team. Now, it was very frail, and it required Sash for most of the time, which was alright, because I was alright getting that value out of Manchow. However, it was pretty bad when next to some mons that did need that Sash support. But overall, Manchow was pretty good for the offensive support. Also, it's very good on maxing out that attack value, maybe even getting it adamant if I can get the speed tiers correct. And then dishing out a close combat or a rock slide. So yeah, nothing much here, no highlight. And we'll lead off into the next mon, which will probably be the low tier MVP for my team. If you've been following me, you know exactly which mon this is. It's Aerodactyl, which I actually found to be my favorite mon to use on this team. If you've been talking to me at all, you know this. So, funny enough, Aerodactyl was a very late season transaction for me. I believe I traded it out for Stunjourner around week 4, and it instantly clicked with the synergy of my team. So the main thing that I liked about this mon, which is a pretty underutilized aspect of it, is its unnervability. So a lot of the offensive pressure that my team creates forces pinch berries onto the opponent's team. So Unnerve was a really good way of actually providing extra support for another offensive sweeper, or even for itself, so that I can bypass those pinch berries and get some nice one-hit KOs. Now, it actually has some surprisingly good coverage options, like Iron Head and Dragon Claw, but also has a few really good support moves, like Taunt and Wildcard and Tailwind. So, I did get to use Wildcard against Toxic, which did impress him, I will have to say. But I just think that Aerodactyl works best, either as a nuker itself, or to support another nuker like Kartana. Well, its only downside is just how frail it is. It's not really going to be able to survive more than 3 turns unless it's just not being targeted in the first place. So, my highlight for this is going to be versus Noah Game 1 this time. This is going to be our highlight here. This is how many kills Aerodactyl gets in this game. So we have a quick compilation of all of those different kills here. Now, Aerodactyl was specifically damage capped in order to get the 2-hit KO on the max zap, and the 1-hit KO on the non-max zap, which is very important against my team, just to let everything survive. Apologies for the corruption there, that was just the footage and how it was. So of course, here's the one kill that it didn't pick up on its own, which was the Tyranitar, which it was able to get most of the chip off of, and the Swampert was just able to finish it off. So, of course, he gets 3 or 4 plus an assist, right? And then we got, of course, the Morgrim and Rotom as the final 2, getting the Rock Slide kill onto the Morgrim, and shutting that down. And finally, a Rotom Nasty Plot, which you would think, oh okay, that'd be kind of harmful, until we just get this next Rock Slide off and kill it this turn anyway. So that's it for the highlight. Alright, so next up is Orbeetle, the last mon we're going to go over. And just as an editor's note, holy shit, this is hard getting in all the gifts, so I'm just glad this is the last one at this point. So Orbeetle, I thought this was very underrated when I picked it up, which I found to be very true in the matchups it was able to come to, and the ways I was able to prep it, I found it very effective. However, don't want to be bringing this to every single match. You want to bring it to the niche scenarios where my team needs it. And my team really needed it as a TR counter. It had some pretty good options as well. I also had some screens that I was able to set up. And of course, 3 attacking moves, which I could choose from based off of what I needed it for. But it was mainly a support option anyway. Now, my TR counter was mainly using Imprison here, which I found to be generally safer than using a counter Trick Room, because I just couldn't risk it. I just didn't have a Trick Room option in the first place. So, Imprison took up a move slot, which sometimes I didn't want to be wasting on just Imprison. I wanted to waste it on the coverage move. And at that point, you're kind of having to sacrifice a screen, either Light Screen or Reflect, if you're really wanting to get a coverage move off, or else you're going full support mode, which can't clutch you a game. And that can be very easily taken advantage of. Also, it had a lot of weaknesses, which I found also to be very limited in where it could come. Also, it's just not great offensively. It doesn't have an offensive presence, and it can't. Even if you have a move, it's only going to clutch you a game if it's another 1v1 against something like a Musharna, or something else that's going to be matching it with its poor offensive stats, but still being able to get the same bulk and, I guess, the same TR presence. So I guess it's very one-dimensional. It just does what it needs to do good enough for me to have it on my roster. So now we're done with all the mons, now we get into a retrospective of my actual draft and my team that I constructed throughout the season. Now, a few good things I really liked about it. It had a lot of offense. I never found that I was lacking an offensive mon for a certain option that I needed. For example, I need a certain coverage move for X mon or Y mon. I always have a certain mon that can get the right type of damage off with the right sort of coverage, and if I didn't have that in my draft, I probably would be a lot worse in the spot right now. Now, I also had a lot of good typing synergies among my mons, especially between Gyarados, Swampert, and Nidoking, to where Swampert shares the same types as Nidoking and Gyarados. However, they are sharing 0 weaknesses with each other, which I tend to find to be very nice in picking the right mon for the right matchup and to the right team comp. So, finally, piece fluidity is kind of what I just mentioned, where I can pick the right mon to go into the right team comp. And I have such a variety of mons that I'm not stuck with the same core of 5 or 6, and then having to switch out a piece or 2 for each matchup. I could choose any group that I wanted, barring a few, but yeah, I had nothing really holding me back which mons I wanted to bring. Now onto the cons. I had no redirection on my team. The only redirection was, well, it was Ally Switch on my Latias, which I did bring once, and it was alright. Now, I also had very limited speed control. I had like a couple months with Tailwind, which I honestly wanted to be more offensive anyway, and maybe 1 or 2 months with Icy Wind. Sorry, but those are always in matchups where I needed those mons to have all their move slots. So I always found myself lacking in those sorts of support options. And there's also not that much defensive support overall. All they really had was a Klefki that could provide screens, and an Orbeetle that was just too flimsy as a tier 4 to actually get anything done. So, going into the next draft, there's some things I'm going to have to look out for, there's some things I'm going to need to actually enjoy. Of course, there's 2 sides of playing Pokemon in a draft format. Of course, you're going to have your draft and you're going to have your team and prep. But of course, you actually have to play well and execute well enough. So, now I have my individual play retrospective, and I'm going to go over some pros in my play, and some cons and things I need to improve for next season. I will say I did greatly improve over the course of the season, and I am very happy with some of the weeks I had. For example, week 5? I believe it was it was week 6. Yeah, week 6 versus Dan. Week 9 versus, who was it? Ryan, in the Wildcard game. And to a certain extent, I'm fairly proud of my first playoffs match versus Matt, the eventual winner. Now, of course, I do have a few things I need to improve on over the course of the season, or over the course of next season, rather. Which are, first, I need to really avoid getting locked into a confusing turn for myself. There were multiple times where I felt lost in what play I needed to make, just because I was in an awkward position. I need to figure out a bit more decisiveness. I need to develop that decisiveness a bit more going into next season. But I think I've done to a certain extent. Especially, you can find it in week 9 versus Ryan, where I actually switched out my max Gyarados on its 3rd turn of being maxed because I didn't want it to get falling asleep. But I do need to create that decisiveness throughout the entirety of my season instead of just waiting till the very end to actually have that fully developed. Also, I do need to plan for long-term win cons earlier into my games. There are multiple times where I was playing my games, and because I didn't make the plays correct early enough on like turns 1 or 2, I wasn't thinking it through enough on turns 1 or 2. I was locking myself in poor choices and getting easy knockouts in like the first couple turns of my game. Giving away easy knockouts rather onto my own mons in the first couple turns of the game, which would turn the tide of the entire match and completely lose me a match just because of that. So I do need to think about this earlier. And finally, I need to avoid over-prepping for one strat without addressing the others properly, which the most egregious example is versus Tay, where it was the only match that I ever flowcharted, funnily enough. I was flowcharting my Trick Room counter because I knew my Trick Room counters were so bad that I extremely needed, to like the utmost extent, to be able to counter that Trick Room if it was coming. And it's just punished by Tay because they did not bring a single Trick Room mod. They didn't bring a Trick Room mode. So I was basically stuck at that point with having to scramble with my remaining pieces to come out with a win. And I did come somewhat close, but it was definitely not as decisive as it could have been because I didn't really put in the correct prep into the team that it brought. So of course, a few things I do need to change as well. I do need to invest in a hard support mod for speed control and redirection, like Follow Me, Rage Powder, and Tailwind or Icy Wind, something like that. I really need to invest in that speed control because without it, I was finding especially my hyper offensive sets were very lacking in the support, and everything was getting knocked out too easily because of something moving way before I wanted it to. Also, I do need to spend some time on formulating my draft this season because, well, this season that I just played, I drafted while doing my own thing. I was unaware. I think I forgot that the draft was happening that day until it actually happened. I was like, oh shit, I gotta actually do this. And I was in the middle of breaking up with someone. So I actually had to do my draft while having this whole event happen in my personal life. And of course, that's not very great. We don't want that to happen. What else is there? So yeah, I do need to actually prep my draft this time and understand where I'm gonna fit in all these different things I need to add to my draft core. And finally, I do need to actually play the game before the season starts, because going into the last season, I hadn't played since April, and you can really see that in like the first 2 to 4 games of the season, where I got dominated by Noah, dominated by Matt, who of course that's kind of expected, but I didn't need it to be to that extent. It wasn't really my true potential. Won in game 3, which is kind of a fluke because I was the worst player in the league at the time anyway. And a loss in week 4 because I really hadn't developed enough yet. Also, I do need to actually practice and play the game between weeks because there were some weeks I just didn't win or I wasn't playing to my potential because I hadn't played since the last match that I had played. So I was out of practice, I wasn't making the correct decisions, I wasn't too familiar with the comps that I was bringing, and overall it was just not a fun experience. So I do need to actually practice and play the game and develop my decision making on a week by week basis in order to bring myself to just a better playmaking style like I had versus Noah, versus Ryan, versus Dan. So I guess that's gonna be it. That's the last of what I have to talk about. The last of really this video being the last video of the season. It was a great season. Really loved playing in it. I hope to see everyone that's watching this video in the league for next season. I hope that's gonna be fun. I hope and pray that I actually get to improve on these things I talked about. Anyways, it's great having you. See you then.